Okay, so we'll pick up where we left off. So we've looked at the market capitalism model. Now, with every model, there's certain kinds of theories, right? So with these kinds of models, there are these represent our assumptions, our beliefs about reality. Okay? Now, these assumptions are not inherently right and wrong. They're something that you can only assume or suppose. Think of a model if you want to look at it in a broader theological sense. Look at it as, well, is there a God? Well, I have no way of actually proving that there is or is not a God. I kind of feel it or I suppose it. Okay? Now, there are theories that go with all of these models. And we're going to talk about some of these theories and concepts that go with the models. By the way, what's a theory? What is a theory used for? Theory is a way that we generalize about the things that we observe in reality. Okay? So, I always like to think of a theory as kind of a stereotype. Now, we usually think about stereotypes as negative, but they can also be very useful. But, of course, they can also be very wrong. Let me give you an example. When I was in graduate school, I had a colleague. This is why it's important to pay the utilities. I'll be right back. And Professor Pelly said, let there be light, and it was so. Okay, so I had a friend who was in graduate school. He was a brilliant statistician, but his oral and written expression in English was beyond terrible, which is even worse because he lived in the States for 7 years. So he comes up to me one day and he says, I want you to teach me English. I said, well, Marco, why do you want to learn English? You know, you've never made any effort before. He said, well, I'd like to go to Brazil. I said, well, why do you want to go to Brazil? Well, because when I go to Carnival, I can talk to the people there. I said, don't you know that they speak Portuguese in Brazil? Oh, he said. So he made some sort of a generalization. He'd met 2 people from Brazil who happened to speak English. So he assumed that English was the language of Brazil. So you see how his theorization or his stereotype was incorrect. Now, a stereotype might actually be useful. Okay? Let's say you want to move to France. Well, what language do I need to learn in France? Well, if you made a generalization, you could say that learning French would be a good idea. However, you would meet people in France who speak a variety of other languages, especially Arabic. So your stereotype wouldn't be 100% right. Your theorization wouldn't be 100% right. But it would represent a pretty good guide for what you should do if you were to move to France. Hopefully that helps. So there's a couple of kind of concepts and theories that go with the market capitalism. Of course, those of us that live in Western countries look at the market economy. Okay? The market economy basically means that people have moved beyond subsistence production to production for trade, and that markets take a central role. Now, what does this mean? Production beyond subsistence to production for trade. Let's think about that for a second. Well, I'll give an example of my grandfather who worked on a farm. Okay? He was a subsistence farmer. That meant that he produced basically just enough food to survive, just enough to eat, just enough to live. He didn't have a lot left over for trading or making any sort of money. He was just trying to live. Okay? Now, as he got older in life, farm machinery became more available to farmers. So he was able to use things like tractors and mechanized equipment, and because of that, he was able to produce more than he could actually eat himself. And he was able to take the leftovers and sell it. Okay? This is an example of the market economy. So when you're in a subsistence mode of production, you produce basically just enough to survive, but when you start to have a surplus in production that can be used for trade, then markets are born and markets start to take on a central role. Of course, we also have capitalism, which is very prevalent in the West, although we'll talk about some exceptions in that. So capitalism is basically this economic ideology that has kind of these values that focus on things like private ownership of the means of production. I should write that on the board. Those of you who have taken economics, this should be a nice review. But you have things like right to private property, including the means of production. You have a right to own your own home, but you also have the right to own a factory, a tractor, anything that you need for production. Of course, you can make a profit. Profits are possible. You have free competition. And of course, limited government restraint in markets. Okay. Low government intervention. So these are the basic assumptions of capitalism. Okay? Contrast that with something like the Soviet Union, where the state owned all the property, including the means of production. Profits, that for personal profit, that was forbidden. Competition didn't exist because the state owned everything, and there was high government intervention in markets because the state controlled everything. That's a very different system than capitalism. And of course, along with that, you also have what we might call managerial capitalism. And that basically says that the market is dominated by larger firms run by salaried managers, not necessarily those small firms that were like owner entrepreneurs back in the day. If you see some sort of a medieval kind of a movie, you might think about a shop owner who sells his wares every day, and then it's pretty much him and his family operating. These are your kind of classic smaller firms run by owner entrepreneurs. Of course, one of the big assumptions of the market capitalism, and of course in neoclassical economics, is laissez-faire. That means that there is a rejection of government intervention in markets. Okay. Laissez-faire is French for leave it be, leave it alone. Leave it be is probably better. Leave you to do as you wish. So the idea is that if the government stays out of the market, then markets will function in an optimal way. Okay, Adam Smith also says, for example, that there's an invisible hand in the market, and that the market is self-regulating and functions best when the government doesn't interfere. Again, individuals can own private property, they can have profits, and they can freely risk their investments. They are free to start any sort of business they want, but they can also invest in things like the stock market. And another assumption, which is very important, is that consumers are informed about products and prices and can make rational decisions. Okay? So that means whenever you view any sort of good, you can readily compare that good with any sort of similar good and make some sort of an evaluation objectively about quality and price. We'll talk a little bit more about why that's not always true in a couple chapters. Again, those of you that have taken neoclassical economics, I think that this should be kind of a review. Another one of Adam Smith's assumptions was that there was kind of a moral restraint of self-interested behavior in businesses. So shop owners would naturally not behave in an inappropriate way. They would not naturally be exploitative. They would kind of look out for people in kind of a corporate social responsibility kind of way. Of course, towards the end of his life, Adam Smith realized this might not be all that true. Of course, they also talk about basic institutions existing to ease commerce. And of course, there are many producers and consumers in competitive markets. Going to move on to